Chapter 1. Caston. The evening light was fading over St. Mary Me when Miss Jane Marple made her way along the familiar path to the village institute, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and she pulled her cardigan a little closer as she approached the modest brick building that served as the heart of so many village activities. Through the tall windows, she could see the warm glow of electric lights and the silhouettes of women already gathered around the long trestle tables. The monthly meeting of the St. Mary Me Knitting Club was always well attended, but tonight promised to be particularly special with their charity drive in full swing and the mysterious mystery SCE swap that had been advertised on the notice board for the past week. "Good evening, Miss Marple," called a brisk voice as she pushed open the heavy wooden door. Beatrix Morton, the club's chairwoman, stood near the entrance with a clipboard in one hand and a ruler in the other, her gray hair pulled back in its customary severe bun. "Right on time, as always. Do come in and choose your seat. We have quite the evening planned." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and surveyed the familiar scene. The hall smelled of beeswax, polish, and wool, with an undertone of the tea preparations already beginning at the far end of the room. About a dozen women were scattered around the tables, their various projects spread before them in orderly arrays of needles, yarn, and patterns. At the table nearest the window sat Mabel Finch, proprietor of Finch's Wool and Haberdashery, her plump fingers already busy with what appeared to be a particularly intricate cable pattern. Her shop bag beside her bulged with various supplies and notions, and she looked up with a welcoming smile as Miss Marple approached. "Oh, Miss Marple, you simply must see the lovely new yarn I've just received," Mabel chirped, holding up a skin of soft blue wool from Scotland, "and such a reasonable price, perfect for baby things." "How thoughtful of you to remember," Miss Marple replied, settling herself at the table and withdrawing her own work from her bag. "I've brought along some vests to finish for the church charity box. There's always such a need for baby clothes." Across the room she noticed Hazel Trent, sitting rather stiffly at a corner table, her dark hair falling forward as she bent over an elaborate lace shawl. There was something about the young woman's posture that suggested she was not entirely at ease this evening, though Miss Marple could not quite put her finger on what it might be. "Ladies, ladies!" Beatrix clapped her hands sharply, calling the room to attention. "If we might begin this evening's proceedings. As you all know, we're here tonight not only for our usual pleasant company, but for our monthly charity drive and our special mystery scheme swap." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the room. Near the tea table, Hester Vale looked up from arranging cups and sauces, her kind face bright with interest. At the far end of the room, Edith Pike, a quiet widow who rarely spoke, but whose knitting was always impeccable, paused in her work to listen. "Now, before we begin our mystery swap," Beatrice continued, tapping her ruler against the table for emphasis, "I must remind everyone that we are expecting the highest standards this evening. Each mystery scheme will require a 20-row tension swatch, and I shall be checking each one personally for gauge and evenness. We must maintain our reputation for excellence." Young Lucy Daring, barely out of her teens, and one of the few members who preferred crochet to knitting, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had joined the club only recently, and still seemed somewhat overwhelmed by Beatrice's exacting standards. Miss Marple threaded her needle and began working on a tiny white vest, her fingers moving with practiced ease, while her eyes took in the details of the evening. She noticed that Inspector Slack's voice could be heard from the adjoining room where the darts club met, punctuated by occasional laughter and the thud of darts hitting the board. "The mystery skeins have been prepared according to our usual system," Beatrice announced, gesturing toward a large wicker basket filled with brown paper packages, each tied with string and bearing a number written in black ink. Each package contains sufficient yarn for your swatch, and the fun, of course, is in not knowing what you'll receive until you begin to work with it. She picked up the basket and began moving around the room. "Now everyone will draw a number from the smaller basket and then collect the corresponding package. Remember, no peeking until you've made your selection." The room filled with excited chatter as the women took turns drawing small folded papers from Beatrice's second basket. Miss Marple drew number 12 and collected a package that felt promisingly soft through its brown paper wrapping. Number 7 called Lucy Daring, holding up her slip of paper. "Ah, number 7, said Edith Pike quietly, looking at her own paper. "Oh, but I seem to have drawn number 3. There was a moment of confusion as papers were compared and packages shifted. Beatrice frowned severely at the apparent muddle with the numbering system, her ruler tapping impatiently against her palm. "Well, really," she muttered, "this is most irregular. Lucy, you take number 7 as you drew it. The system must be maintained properly." As the evening settled into its familiar rhythm of clicking needles and gentle conversation, Miss Marple found herself watching the interplay of personalities around the room. Lady Bantry had arrived fashionably late, as was her custom, and had seated herself with a flourish and an amusing story about her latest gardening disaster. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement had also joined the gathering, as they often did when the knitting club met, bringing with them the comfortable presence of the vicarage and gentle inquiries about various parish matters. "I do hope everyone remembered our strict policy about refreshments this evening," Beatrice announced suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the room. She fixed her gaze particularly on Ha Vale, who was arranging a plate of scone beside the tea-urn. "Absolutely no nuts in anything. No almonds, no hazelnuts, no peanuts, nothing of that nature whatsoever." Ha looked up slightly flustered. "Oh yes, of course, Mrs. Morton. I've been most careful. Even the butter is specially marked as nut-free, and I made certain to check every ingredient. There's a sign right here. See?" She pointed to a small handwritten card propped against the milk jug. Miss Marple glanced over at the tea table, noting the careful arrangements and the obvious attention Ha had paid to Beatrice's requirements. She knew, as did everyone in the village, about Beatrice's severe allergy to nuts, which had been the cause of more than one social gathering being rearranged to accommodate her needs. The mystery packages were now distributed, and the room filled with the gentle sounds of paper rustling as the women began to unwrap their surprises. Exclamations of delight and curiosity punctuated the evening air as various textures and colors were revealed. "Oh, how lovely!" exclaimed Lucy, holding up a sea of what appeared to be linen blend in a soft, natural color. "Though it feels a bit stiff, I wonder if there's something one can do about that." "The internet has all sorts of suggestions these days," Hazel murmured, not looking up from her own unwrapping, though one must be careful about following advice from unreliable sources. Miss Marple unwrapped her own package to reveal a beautiful soft wool in a delicate shade of pink, perfect for baby clothes. She smiled with genuine pleasure and began to cast on her 20 stitches for the required swatch. The evening progressed peacefully, with the familiar rhythm of village life settling over the gathered women. Needles clicked, tea was poured, and the gentle hum of conversation created the comfortable atmosphere that made these gatherings so treasured by all who attended. Beatrice moved around the room with her ruler and clipboard, checking on progress and offering advice, though her suggestions often came with a sharp edge that made some of the members gulluse slightly. Her dedication to perfection was admirable, Miss Marple reflected, though perhaps not always delivered with the gentlest of touches. As the first hour passed, the mystery skeins revealed their secrets, and the swatches began to take shape. Miss Marple found herself particularly interested in the various approaches each knitter took to their work, noting the small habits and preferences that made each person's technique unique. It was, she thought contentedly, shaping up to be a perfectly ordinary evening in St. Mary Me, filled with the simple pleasures of good company and productive work. How wrong, she would later reflect, that assessment would prove to be. Chapter 2. Nut-Free Tea. The clock on the Institute wall had just chimed 8 when Beatrice Morton rose from her seat. Ruler still firmly grasped in her right hand, she surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a general reviewing well-ordered troops, noting the progress each member had made on their mystery swatch. "Ladies," she announced, her voice carrying its usual note of authority, "I believe this would be an appropriate moment for our refreshment break. But before we partake of Ha's excellent hospitality, I feel I must emphasize once again the importance of our strictly nut-free policy this evening." She walked purposefully toward the tea table where Ha Vale was already lifting the large brown teapot with both hands. The scone were arranged in neat rows on a floured plate, accompanied by small dishes of jam and what appeared to be fresh butter. "Now, I don't wish to seem overly cautious," Beatrix continued, fixing Ha with a particularly penetrating stare. "But, as you all well know, even the smallest trace of nuts can prove extremely dangerous for someone with my particular sensitivity. I do hope you've been most careful with your preparations." Ha's pleasant face flushed slightly pink. "Oh, Mrs. Morton, you needn't worry in the slightest. I've checked every single ingredient twice over. The butter is from Marks and Spencer, clearly labeled as Nutri, and the jam is my own strawberry preserve made with nothing but fruit and sugar. Even the flour for the scone came from a mill that specifically states no nuts are processed in their facility." She gestured toward her carefully lettered sign, which proclaimed strictly nut-free refreshments in her neat schoolmistress handwriting. The scone themselves contain only flour, butter, milk, and a touch of sugar. Hester continued earnestly. "I mixed them in a bowl that I washed specially for the occasion, and I've even brought my own wooden spoon to ensure there could be no contamination from previous baking." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, observing Beatrice's expression softened somewhat at this thorough explanation. The chairwoman's allergy was indeed severe, as the entire village had learned some years ago when an unfortunate incident at the church fete had required Dr. Haydock's immediate attention. "Well then," Beatrice said, her tone marginally less sharp. "I suppose we may proceed, though I do hope everyone will be mindful of cross-contamination. Please use the serving spoons provided rather than your own knives or forks." The Nits began to set aside their work and move toward the tea table. Miss Marple carefully placed her pink swatch on the table, noting that she had completed nearly 15 rows of perfectly even stockinette stitch. Around the room, the other mystery project showed varying degrees of progress. Lucy Daring seemed to be struggling somewhat with her linen yarn, which appeared rather stiff and difficult to work with. She had been rubbing the strand between her fingers periodically, as if trying to soften its texture. "Having difficulties, dear?" Miss Marple inquired gently as she passed Lucy's chair. "Oh, it's nothing serious," Lucy replied, though her frown suggested otherwise. "It's just that this linen is so very stiff. I read somewhere on the internet that you can soften plant fibers by treating them with oil, but I'm not sure if that would be appropriate for a swatch that Mrs. Morton is going to inspect." "The internet is a wonderful resource," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though perhaps traditional methods are safest when one is uncertain. At the tea table, Lady Bantry was regaling Hester with a typically amusing account of her cook's latest culinary disaster, while Mrs. Clement nodded sympathetically and added gentle commentary. The Reverend had joined Inspector Slack's dark game in the adjoining room, and his occasional exclamations of triumph or dismay provided a pleasant background to the feminine chatter. Mabel Finch bustled about with her usual efficiency, offering to help pour tea and generally making herself useful in the way of someone accustomed to customer service. She had brought along a small bag of shop samples and notions, which she had spread on a side table for anyone who might be interested. "Oh, Mabel," Beatrice called out, having accepted a cup of tea and a scone from Ha's careful hands. "I notice you've brought some of those needle conditioners again. So thoughtful of you to share them with the club." "It's nothing at all," Mabel replied cheerfully, indicating a small brown bottle among her wares. "The traveling salesman left several samples, and I thought they might be useful. Just a dab on bamboo needles prevents that annoying squeak, you know." Miss Marple accepted her own cup of tea and selected a modest portion of scone, noting with approval the careful way Ha had arranged everything to prevent any possibility of contamination. The jam was indeed beautifully clear, with whole strawberries visible in the preserve, and the butter was fresh and sweet. She was just returning to her seat when Beatrice began to speak again, her voice taking on the particular tone she used for important announcements. "Before we continue with our evening's work, I feel I should mention that we shall need to address some club business in the coming weeks. Specifically, I shall be presenting a detailed accounting of our yarn fund expenditures at next month's meeting." There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. Miss Marple, her senses finely tuned to such changes after decades of observing human nature, noted the way several faces turned toward Mabel Finch, whose cheerful expression seemed to freeze somewhat. "An accounting?" Mabel asked, her voice perhaps a touch higher than usual, "but surely that's hardly necessary. I mean, all the receipts are perfectly in order, and everyone knows how carefully I manage the club's purchases." "I'm certain they are," Beatrice replied smoothly, returning to her seat with her teacup. "But good practice demands regular review of all financial matters. Nothing personal, you understand, but proper procedures must be followed." She picked up her knitting again, the bamboo circular needles gleaming under the electric lights. Her mystery yarn had turned out to be a lovely wool blend in a soft gray color, and she had been making excellent progress on her swatch. Miss Marple noticed that Beatrice had developed the habit, common among many knits, of moistening the yarn end with her lips when joining a new length. It was one of those small unconscious gestures that became second nature after years of working with wool and thread. "Now then," Beatrice continued, settling back into her familiar rhythm of knitting while talking, "we really must maintain our focus on technique this evening. I shall be checking each swatch most carefully for tension and evenness." She paused to examine her work, holding it up to the light to check for any irregularities. As she did so, she absently wet the end of her yarn with her tongue before continuing the next row. The conversation gradually returned to more comfortable topics. Hazel Trent mentioned a new pattern she had been developing, though there seemed to be some history there that Miss Marple couldn't quite grasp from the subdued way the other members responded. Edith Pike, as usual, worked in quiet concentration, her needles moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had been knitting since childhood. It was perhaps 10 minutes later when Beatrice first cleared her throat. Miss Marple looked up from her own work to see the chairwoman rubbing her throat with a free hand, a puzzled expression crossing her face. She cleared her throat again, more forcefully this time. "Excuse me," Beatrix said, her voice sounding slightly thick. "I seem to have developed a bit of a tickle." She continued knitting for another minute or two, but Miss Marple noticed that her breathing seemed to be becoming somewhat labored. The color in her cheeks, which had been normal, was beginning to deepen to an alarming pink. "Mrs. Morton," Ha called out anxiously from the tea table, "are you quite all right? You look rather flushed." Beatrice put down her knitting and pressed both hands to her throat. Her breathing was now distinctly wheezy, and her face was taking on a distinctly red color that Miss Marple recognized with growing alarm. I can't," Beatrice gasped, rising unsteadily from her chair. "Something's wrong. Can't breathe properly." The room erupted into sudden activity. Lady Bantry jumped to her feet, knocking over her teacup in the process. Mrs. Clement rushed toward Beatrice, her face filled with concern. "It's her allergy!" cried Mabel Finch. "Someone fetch Dr. Haddock immediately." Miss Marple moved swiftly but calmly toward Beatrice, who was now swaying dangerously and making harsh, labored sounds with each attempt to breathe. The woman's face was becoming increasingly red and puffy, her eyes beginning to water profusely. "The scone!" gasped Ha, pointing a trembling finger at the tea table. "Oh, my goodness! Could there have been nuts in the scone somehow? But I was so careful, so very careful." Lucy Daring had run to the adjoining room and was calling urgently for Dr. Haddock, while the sound of chairs scraping and alarmed voices filled the air. Inspector Slack's heavy footsteps could be heard approaching rapidly. By the time Dr. Haddock arrived, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with professional concern, Beatrice Morton had collapsed onto the polished floor of the Institute Hall, her breathing shallow and her face alarmingly swollen. The room, which had been filled with the peaceful sounds of clicking needles and gentle conversation, now smelled of wool and polish. But underneath those familiar scents, Miss Marple detected something else entirely. Something with a faint, sweet warmth that spoke of roasted nuts. As Dr. Heddock worked frantically over Beatrix's still form, Miss Marple found herself looking around the room with new eyes. Her gaze fell upon the bamboo needles that Beatrice had been using, which now lay abandoned on the table beside her unfinished swatch. In the bright electric light, the smooth bamboo tips seemed to glint oddly, as if they had been touched with some kind of oil or grease. It was a detail that, in the midst of the current crisis, no one else appeared to have noticed. Chapter 3. Grease on Bamboo. The Institute Hall had taken on the hushed solemnity that follows tragedy. Dr. Hawk had done everything in his power, but Beatrice Morton's severe allergic reaction had progressed too rapidly for medical intervention to be effective. Her still form lay covered with Mrs. Clement's knitting shawl, while Inspector Slack moved about the room with the methodical efficiency of a man who had seen such scenes too many times before. "Nobody is to touch anything," Slack announced firmly, though his voice carried a note of weariness. "This room is now sealed until we can determine exactly what happened here tonight." The surviving members of the knitting club huddled together near the windows, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. Ha Valley sat in a chair with her head in her hands, still repeating, "But I was so careful, so very careful," while Lady Bantry attempted to console her with gentle pats on the shoulder. Miss Marple, however, had positioned herself quietly near the table, where Beatrice's work still lay abandoned. With the careful movements of someone who understood the importance of preserving evidence, she studied the scene before her without disturbing anything. "Inspector," she said softly, "might I suggest we examine Mrs. Morton's knitting materials more closely? There seems to be something rather unusual about her needles." Slack looked up from his notebook, where he had been recording the basic facts of the evening. "What sort of unusual, Miss Marple? If you would look at the bamboo tips, you'll notice they have a rather glossy appearance, almost as if they had been treated with some kind of oil or conditioner." Moving closer, Slack peered at the circular needles that lay beside Beatrice's unfinished swatch. Under the electric light, the smooth bamboo surface indeed showed a thin, gleaming film that caught the illumination in an oddly persistent way. "Now that you mention it," he said slowly, "there does seem to be something there. But what would that have to do with her allergic reaction? Surely the problem was with the food." Miss Marple bent slightly closer to the needles, though she was careful not to touch them. A very faint scent seemed to emanate from the bamboo tips, something warm and nutty that was decidedly not the lanolin smell one might expect from wool work. "If you examine the ferrule of that left needle," she said quietly, "you'll notice a small amber drop. It appears to be some kind of oil." Slack produced a clean handkerchief from his pocket and carefully dabbed at the tiny droplet Miss Marple had indicated. When he pressed the cloth against a sheet of white paper from his notebook, it left a distinct oily halo that seemed to spread and persist rather than being absorbed. "That's definitely some kind of oil," he agreed. "But I still don't see how needle oil would cause what happened to Mrs. Morton." Miss Marple's gaze moved to the notions table that Mabel Finch had set up with her shop samples. Among the various items scattered, there was a squat brown bottle with a simple white label. "Perhaps we should examine that bottle of needle conditioner," she suggested. "Mrs. Finch mentioned it earlier this evening, and Mrs. Morton seemed familiar with its use." The bottle was indeed labeled Needle Conditioner L in neat black letters. Slack carefully lifted it, noting that the cap showed signs of recent use, with a thin thread of oil visible around the rim. "Mrs. Finch," he called out, to where Mabel sat among the other shocked nits. "This bottle of needle conditioner. Can you tell me about it?" Mabel looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Oh, that? Yes. It's something new the traveling salesman brought round for preventing squeaks in bamboo needles, you know. Just requires a tiny dab on the tips. I thought it might be useful for the club members, and the L on the label stands for lanolin. Of course, that's what he told me. Anyway, it's supposed to be pure lanolin for conditioning the bamboo." Miss Marple moved closer to the table where Beatrice's knitting bag sat open. Inside, among the usual collection of scissors, stitch markers, and spare yarn, was a small auto-injector pen, still in its protective case. "Inspector, you might want to examine this as well," she said, indicating the medical device. "It appears to be Mrs. Morton's emergency medication." Slack carefully removed the injector, noting that while the safety cap had been removed, the device itself had never been activated. The plastic cap showed small indentation marks as if someone had bitten down on it in panic. She tried to use it, he observed grimly, but something went wrong. Either she couldn't manage it in her distressed state, or perhaps there wasn't time. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Morton was known for being very methodical in her habits. She always kept her emergency medication close at hand, and yet she apparently couldn't deploy it when needed. She turned her attention back to Beatrice's knitting project. The gray wool swatch lay exactly as it had been abandoned, with the working yarn still attached to the ball. What interested Miss Marple particularly was the way the yarn seemed to have been handled. "Note how Mrs. Morton's yarn shows signs of having been moistened," she said to Slack. "There, where it joins to the main ball. It's a common habit among knits to wet the end with their tongue when joining new lengths of yarn." The inspector nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't yet see the significance of this observation. "3 habits," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. Mrs. Morton's severe nut allergy, her tendency to moisten yarn ends while working, and Mrs. Finch's generous nature in providing helpful supplies for the club. She paused, looking around the room with the careful attention of someone piecing together a complex puzzle. The scent of roasted nuts still seemed to hang faintly in the air, though the tea table had been thoroughly examined, and nothing suspicious found among Ha's carefully prepared refreshments. "Inspector, I believe we may find that this tragedy was not caused by contaminated food at all," Miss Marple said quietly. "The answer may lie in those innocent-seeming knitting supplies." Slack looked skeptical. "You're suggesting someone deliberately poisoned knitting needles? That seems rather far-fetched, Miss Marple. Not poisoned, exactly. But consider this. If someone were to substitute a different oil for the harmless lanolin in that conditioning bottle, an oil derived from nuts, perhaps, then anyone using it on their needles would unknowingly be handling a dangerous allergen. But how would that affect Mrs. Morton? She wasn't eating the needles." Miss Marple gestured toward the abandoned knitting. Mrs. Morton had the habit of moistening her yarn with her lips. If her needles had been treated with nut oil, and if she handled that yarn and then touched it to her mouth, she let the sentence trail off meaningfully. The inspector's expression grew more serious as he began to understand the implications. "You're saying someone knew about her habits and used them against her? It's possible, though, of course. We would need to test that bottle to determine what it actually contains and examine the needles more thoroughly for traces of allergens." Miss Marple looked around the room once more, taking in the faces of the surviving knitting club members. Each woman sat in her own sphere of shock and grief, but she couldn't help noting the subtle differences in their reactions. Some, like Havale, seemed overwhelmed by guilt and self-recrimination. Others, like Lady Bantry and Mrs. Clement, displayed the shocked sorrow one would expect from losing a long-time acquaintance. But there was something in the way Mabel Finch sat, very still and quiet, that suggested a different quality of distress entirely. "We shall need to examine everything very carefully," Miss Marple said finally. "Sometimes the most innocent-seeming object can conceal the most deadly intentions." Chapter 4. Two Swaps. The following morning brought a gray drizzle that seemed to echo the somber mood hanging over St. Mary Me. Inspector Slack had returned to the Institute Hall early, accompanied by a constable and several items of equipment for a more thorough examination of the previous evening's events. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, having spent a restless night turning over the details of Beatrix Morton's tragic death. She found the inspector carefully photographing the abandoned knitting projects, each still positioned exactly where it had been left the night before. "I've been thinking about those mystery skeins," she said without preamble. "Particularly about the confusion with the numbering system that occurred during the drawing." Slack looked up from his camera. "The mix-up with the tickets, you mean? Seemed like ordinary confusion to me. These sorts of social events rarely run smoothly, perhaps. But I wonder if we might examine the tickets themselves more closely, and the brown paper packages as well." They moved to where the remaining mystery skins sat in their basket. Most had been unwrapped the previous evening, their contents revealed and their papers discarded. But a few remained untouched after the tragedy had interrupted the proceedings. "Now then," Miss Marple said, settling her spectacles more firmly on her nose. "Young Lucy mentioned that she had drawn number 7, but I distinctly recall Mrs. Pike saying something about numbers being muddled." Slack nodded, consulting his notes from the previous evening. "Mrs. Pike drew number 3 initially, and Miss Daring got number 7, but there was some confusion, and they ended up sorting it out between themselves." Miss Marple moved to where Lucy's abandoned work lay on the table. The linen yarn that had emerged from package number 7 was spread beside her partially completed swatch, and the brown paper wrapping lay crumpled nearby. "If you would examine this paper," she said, smoothing out the wrapping carefully, "you'll notice something rather interesting." The paper bore the number 7 written in black ink. But as Slack looked more closely, he could see that there was something odd about the marking. The number seemed to lean distinctly to the left, quite different from the other tickets he had observed. "That's a left-handed writer," he said with growing interest. "But most of the other numbers were written by someone right-handed." "Precisely. And if you look here," Miss Marple pointed to a corner of the paper, "there's a small grease stain, and what appears to be a price mark made with pencil, the sort of marking one might find on tissue paper from a shop." They turned their attention to the small basket that had held the numbered tickets. Several crumpled papers remained inside, and Slack carefully smoothed them out on the table. "Look here," he said after a moment. There are two number 7s. This first one is written in the same hand as most of the others, but this second one definitely shows that left-handed slant you mentioned. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I believe we may find that someone prepared an extra ticket and substituted it during the drawing process, but that raises the question of why anyone would go to such trouble over a simple knitting exercise. They moved to examine Lucy's mystery scheme more closely. The linen blend yarn was indeed rather stiff, as she had complained the previous evening, but there was something else about it that caught Miss Marple's attention. Feel the texture of this yarn, she suggested to Slack. Compare it to the linen in that other package over there. The inspector handled both skis carefully, noting the difference immediately. This one feels slightly tacky, almost as if it's been treated with something. Miss Daring mentioned that she'd read about softening linen with oil. I wonder if she attempted to treat this yarn before the meeting. As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy herself appeared at the door of the hall, her young face drawn with worry and sleeplessness. "Oh, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack, I hope you don't mind my coming back. I couldn't stop thinking about poor Mrs. Morton, and I wondered if there was anything I could do to help. Actually, my dear, you might be able to clarify something for us," Miss Marple said gently. "Your mystery yarn from last evening, the linen blend. Did you treat it with anything before the meeting?" Lucy's face brightened slightly. "Oh, yes, I did try something I read about online. The internet suggested that you could soften linen by rubbing it with oil. So I tried it yesterday afternoon, but I only used olive oil from the kitchen. Mother grows herbs in it, so I knew it was perfectly pure." "And you're quite certain it was olive oil? Nothing else?" "Absolutely certain. I took it from the bottle in our kitchen cupboard. Extra virgin olive oil," it said on the label. Slack made notes, while Miss Marple continued her gentle questioning. "Now, about the ticket drawing last evening. Can you recall exactly how you came to receive package number 7? Lucy frowned, clearly trying to remember the details. "Well, I drew a ticket from Mrs. Morton's basket, and it had the number 7 written on it. But then Mrs. Pike said something about having number 3, and there seemed to be some confusion about which packages belonged to whom. Did Mrs. Morton herself draw a ticket?" "Oh, yes. She drew one first as the chairwoman. I think she had number 3 initially, but then somehow she ended up with number 7 instead. Mrs. Morton was quite particular about following proper procedures, so she seemed a bit flustered by the mix-up." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. "So Mrs. Morton originally drew number 3, but ended up with number 7, the package that contained the oil-treated linen." "I suppose so. Yes, though I'm not sure exactly how the switching happened. Everything was a bit chaotic with so many people drawing tickets at once." After Lucy had left, promising to return if she remembered any other details, Miss Marple and Slack continued their examination of the evidence. "It's beginning to look as though someone deliberately engineered the situation so that Mrs. Morton would receive that particular package," Slack observed. "Indeed, and the fact that the linen had been pre-treated with oil, even innocent olive oil, would have made it feel different from ordinary yarn. Someone familiar with textiles would have noticed that immediately." Miss Marple picked up the brown paper that had wrapped package number 7, studying the pencil mark more closely. "This pricing notation," she said, pointing to the faint markings, has a very particular style, the way the numbers are formed, and that distinctive fraction mark. I believe I've seen similar markings before. Where would that have been? In Finch's wool and haberdashery, Mrs. Finch has a very characteristic way of marking her prices on tissue paper. She uses a particular type of pencil and has a distinctive method of writing fractions. Slack looked up sharply. You're suggesting Mrs. Finch prepared that package. I'm suggesting that the paper came from her shop at the very least. Whether she prepared the package herself, or whether someone else used her materials, remains to be determined. Miss Marple moved to examine the remaining evidence with renewed interest. The more she studied the details of the evening's events, the more convinced she became that Beatrix Morton's death had been carefully planned, using the innocent rituals of the knitting club as a cover for murder. 2 swaps, she murmured to herself. The ticket swap that ensured Mrs. Morton received the treated yarn, and perhaps another swap as well. The substitution of genuine lanolin with something far more dangerous. The gray morning light filtering through the Institute windows seemed to highlight every detail with stark clarity, and Miss Marple felt that familiar sensation of pieces falling into place that always accompanied her most successful investigations. Someone had used the cozy, familiar world of the knitting club to commit a very clever murder indeed. Chapter 5. The Scone That Wasn't. Dr. Haydock arrived at the Institute shortly before noon, carrying his black medical bag and wearing the grave expression that accompanied his more serious professional duties. Inspector Slack had requested a preliminary examination of the circumstances surrounding Beatrix Morton's death, and the doctor's findings would be crucial to understanding exactly what had occurred. Classic anaphylaxis, he announced after consulting his notes. Textbook case, I'm afraid. The swelling, the respiratory distress, the rapidity of onset, all consistent with severe allergic reaction to nuts. Miss Marple, who had remained in the hall throughout the morning's investigations, looked up from where she had been quietly observing the tea-table arrangements that remained exactly as they had been left the previous evening. And you found no other contributing factors, Doctor? No signs of poisoning or physical injury? None whatsoever. Whatever caused Mrs. Morton's reaction, it was definitely an allergen, and almost certainly nuts of some variety. The question is how she came into contact with them when everyone was so careful about the refreshments. Slack gestured toward the tea-table where Ha Vale's scone still sat on their floured plate, now looking rather faint in the gray morning light. We've had those scone tested thoroughly. He said not a trace of nuts in any of them. The butter, the jam, even the flour that Mrs. Vale used all completely clean. Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. Mrs. Vale was quite right to be so careful. I've treated Mrs. Morton's reactions before, and they were always extremely severe. Even the smallest contamination could have proven fatal. Miss Marple moved closer to the tea-table, her attention focused on details that others might have overlooked. The teacups and saucers were arranged in neat rows. The milk jug stood beside the sugar bowl, and Ha's carefully lettered, strictly nut-free refreshment sign remained propped against the large brown teapot. Dr. Haydock, she said thoughtfully, you mentioned that you've treated Mrs. Morton's allergic reactions before. Were they always triggered by ingestion, or could contact with the skin cause similar symptoms? Contact reactions were certainly possible with someone as sensitive as Mrs. Morton, though usually less severe than what we saw last night." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she was examining a knitted tea cozy that covered the large brown pot. The cozy was done in a cheerful yellow wool with small blue flowers, and appeared to be hand-knitted in a traditional pattern. "Inspector," she said suddenly, "might I suggest you look inside this tea cozy? There appear to be some initials embroidered on the inner lining." Slack carefully lifted the cozy, revealing the letters MF stitched in small, neat script on the white cotton lining. "Mabel Finch," he said immediately. "So Mrs. Finch contributed this as well as the needle conditioner. Indeed, and if you notice, the area around the spout seems rather damp, as if someone had been handling the teapot frequently, perhaps helping with the pouring." Dr. Haydock watched this exchange with growing interest. "You're thinking Mrs. Morton might have come into contact with the allergen through the tea service, rather than the food itself?" Miss Marple moved to examine the bottle of needle conditioner that still sat among Mabel shop samples. In the clearer daylight, certain details about the label became more apparent. "Dr. Hawk, you're familiar with lanolin, I assume? Could you tell us what this substance smells like to you?" The doctor took the bottle and removed the cap carefully, sniffing the contents with professional interest. "That's not lanolin," he said immediately. "Lanolin has a very distinctive woolly scent, rather like sheep. This has an entirely different odor. Rather nutty, actually. Quite pleasant. But definitely not lanolin." Slack made notes while Miss Marple continued her examination of the tea table. She noticed that one of the stitch markers from Mabel's collection had a small smear of the same oily substance that had been found on Beatrice's needles. It appears that someone was quite generous with their application of this so-called needle conditioner, she observed. "Look here, Inspector. This stitch marker shows clear evidence of having been handled with oily fingers." Moving back to where Beatrice's abandoned work lay, Miss Marple studied the tension swatch more carefully. Under good light, she could see that 2 rows in particular showed a slightly different texture from the rest, as if the yarn had passed through treated fingers at those specific points. "Dr. Haddock," she said, "if someone with oily hands containing nut residue were to handle yarn, and if that yarn were then moistened and touched to the lips repeatedly, the allergen would be transferred directly to the mouth and absorbed through the mucous membranes." The doctor finished grimly. "It would be an extremely efficient method of delivery, actually, much more so than simple skin contact." Slack was beginning to look decidedly uncomfortable. "Are you suggesting that someone deliberately contaminated Mrs. Morton's knitting materials with nut oil?" "I'm suggesting that we need to look very carefully at who had opportunity to handle both the needle conditioner and Mrs. Morton's work," Miss Marple replied mildly. She turned her attention to the assembled evidence, noting the various red herrings that seemed to point in different directions. There was Hazel Trent's obvious resentment over some past grievance with Beatrice, something about a disqualified pattern that had clearly caused bad feeling. There was Lucy's innocent experiment with oil treatment, which could easily be misconstrued as suspicious. And there was Edith Pike's quiet demeanor, which might conceal any number of private grudges. "The interesting thing about this case," Miss Marple mused, "is how many perfectly innocent actions could appear suspicious under scrutiny. Miss Daring's oil treatment, Mrs. Trent's resentment, even Mrs. Pike's habitual quietness. Any of them could provide motive or opportunity if one were looking for a convenient suspect. Dr. Haydock packed his medical bag with efficient movements. Well, whatever the method, I can tell you that Mrs. Morton died from nut allergy, pure and simple. No other cause of death is possible, given the symptoms I observed. After the doctor had left, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack continued their methodical examination of the evidence. The small brown bottle with its misleading label seemed to be at the center of everything. Yet proving deliberate substitution would require more than circumstantial evidence. "The question we must ask ourselves," Miss Marple said as she carefully rewrapped Beatrice's knitting in clean paper, "is not just who had opportunity to substitute the contents of that bottle, but who would have known enough about Mrs. Morton's habits to predict exactly how the contamination would be transferred?" She paused by the tea table one final time, noting the careful arrangement of cups and the considerate way everything had been laid out for the club members' comfort. Someone who knew about the knitting club's routines, about Mrs. Morton's severe allergy, and about her particular habits when working with yarn. Someone who could move freely around the room, offering helpful assistance without arousing suspicion. The gray afternoon light was beginning to fade as they prepared to leave the Institute Hall. Tomorrow would bring new questions, and Miss Marple hoped clearer answers about who had turned a pleasant evening of charitable knitting into an occasion for murder. But already she felt the familiar stirring of understanding that told her the solution was beginning to take shape in her mind. Chapter 6. Monogram on the Bottle. The third day of the investigation dawned crisp and clear with autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Institute Hall. Miss Marple arrived early, carrying a small magnifying glass and wearing the determined expression of someone who intended to examine every detail with the utmost care. Inspector Slack was already there, having spent considerable time the previous evening thinking about the growing complexity of the case. The evidence seemed to point in several directions at once, and he was grateful for Miss Marple's methodical approach to sorting through the various possibilities. "I've been thinking about that bottle," Miss Marple announced without preamble, specifically about the label and how it might have been altered. She moved to where the brown bottle of supposed needle conditioner sat on the evidence table, positioning it carefully under the bright morning light that poured through the eastern windows. "If you examine the label very closely, Inspector, I believe you'll find some interesting details that weren't visible under electric illumination." Slack joined her, squinting at the white paper label with its neat black lettering proclaiming Needle Conditioner L. At first glance, it appeared perfectly ordinary, but as his eyes adjusted to the strong, natural light, he began to see what Miss Marple had noticed. "There's something underneath," he said slowly. "Ghost letters, as if another label had been removed, and this one pasted over it." "Precisely. And if you look at the edge here, you can just make out the curve of what might be a G, and there, the tail of what could be a D. The original label was removed, but not quite completely." Miss Marple handed him her magnifying glass, and under its enhanced view, the phantom letters became more distinct. The suggestion of was clearly visible, along with what appeared to be partial letters that might spell oil. "Ground oil," Slack said, with sudden understanding. "Someone relabeled a bottle of groundnut oil to make it appear to be lanolin." "And groundnut oil," as I'm sure you know, is simply another name for peanut oil. Precisely the sort of substance that would prove fatal to someone with Mrs. Morton's severe allergy. They turned their attention to the bottle screw cap, which Miss Marple examined with particular interest. Under the magnifying glass, she could see that someone had scratched a small letter M into the metal, with what appeared to be a sharp instrument. A knitting needle would make exactly that sort of mark, she observed, and it's the sort of thing someone might do to identify their own supplies when sharing them with others. Slack made careful notes, while Miss Marple continued her examination of the physical evidence. On the table nearby lay several stitch markers from Mabel's collection, and one of them showed a distinct smear of the same oily substance that had been found on Beatrice's bamboo needles. It appears that whoever applied this false conditioner was not entirely careful about avoiding contamination of other items. Miss Marple noted, "This stitch marker has clearly been handled by someone with oily fingers." Moving to examine Beatrice's abandoned knitting project once more, Miss Marple could see under the bright daylight that 2 rows of the tension swatch showed a distinctly different texture from the surrounding work. "Look here, Inspector. These particular rows appear to have been knitted with yarn that had passed through treated hands. The wool has a slight glossy quality that's quite different from the rest of the work." Slack studied the evidence with growing concern. "You're building a case for deliberate murder, Miss Marple, but we still need to consider the other possibilities. What about Miss Trent's obvious resentment toward Mrs. Morton, or Miss Daring's oil experiment that went wrong somehow?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, there are several red herrings that could easily mislead an investigation. Miss Trent's grievance over her disqualified pattern provides a clear motive for resentment, and Miss Daring's innocent attempt to soften linen with olive oil could certainly appear suspicious to someone not familiar with the facts." She paused by the window, looking out at the peaceful village street, where ordinary life continued undisturbed by the tragedy that had occurred within these walls. Then there's Mrs. Pike's habitual quietness, which might conceal any number of private grudges or resentments. People often assume that the quiet ones are harboring secret animosities. Slack consulted his notebook, where he had been recording details about each of the knitting club members. Any of them could have brought oil to the meeting. Any of them could have had access to Mrs. Morton's needles during the confusion of the evening. True. But consider this. Whoever substituted the contents of that bottle had to know several very specific things. First, they needed to understand Mrs. Morton's severe allergy and exactly how it might be triggered. Second, they needed to know her personal habits when knitting, particularly her tendency to moisten yarn ends with her lips. Miss Marple moved back to the evidence table, where the various items told their silent story of careful planning and deliberate deception. Third, they needed access to both the original bottle and a suitable substitute oil. And finally, they needed the ability to move about the room freely, offering helpful assistance without arousing any suspicion. She picked up one of the mystery skein packages, noting again the distinctive price pencil markings on the brown paper wrapping. "These markings are quite characteristic, Inspector. The way the numbers are formed, the particular style of fractional notation. I've seen this exact technique before. Where would that have been? In Finn's wool and haberdashery. Mrs. Finch has a very distinctive way of marking prices on tissue paper. She uses a special pencil, and has developed her own shorthand system over years of shopkeeping. Slack looked up sharply. So, the paper came from her shop, but that doesn't necessarily mean she prepared the package herself. No, indeed. But it does suggest that whoever did prepare it had access to her shop materials. And consider the sequence of events. The duplicate ticket that ensured Mrs. Morton received the oil-treated linen yarn, the helpful offer of needle conditioner that was actually peanut oil, and the general assistance with tea service that provided multiple opportunities for contamination. Miss Marple examined the tea cozy with the MF monogram once more, noting how damp it remained around the spout area. Someone who knew the routines of the knitting club intimately. Someone who could offer help and supplies without seeming out of place. Someone who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to orchestrate this very clever murder. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the evidence table and highlighting every detail with crystal clarity. Miss Marple felt that familiar sense of pieces falling into place that always accompanied her most successful investigations. But we must be very careful not to jump to conclusions, she cautioned Slack. The evidence must speak for itself, and we must follow it wherever it leads, regardless of our personal feelings about the individuals involved. As they prepared to leave the Institute Hall for another day of investigation, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on how the cozy, familiar world of village life could conceal such careful planning and deadly intent. Someone had used the innocent rituals of charitable knitting to commit murder, and she was determined to see that justice was done for poor Beatrix Morton. Chapter 7. Midnight in the Wool Shop. Miss Marple had spent the evening in her sitting room, knitting quietly and thinking about the peculiar circumstances surrounding Beatrix Morton's death. Something about the case continued to trouble her. A nagging sense that there were still pieces of evidence waiting to be discovered. It was nearly 11 o'clock when she made a decision that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew the habits of elderly village ladies. She telephoned Inspector Slack. "Inspector, I hope I'm not disturbing you too late in the evening, but I've been thinking about Mrs. Finch's shop. Might it be worth having someone keep an eye on the premises tonight?" Slack's voice was weary but alert. "What sort of eye, Miss Marple? Are you expecting something to happen? I have a feeling that someone might wish to tidy up any loose ends that could prove inconvenient. The sort of tidying that's best done when one is unlikely to be observed." Within the hour, Sergeant Lake had positioned himself discreetly across from Finch's wall and haberdashery, settled in for what he assumed would be a quiet night's watch. The shop stood dark and silent among the row of village businesses, its cheerful window display of autumn yarns barely visible in the pale moonlight. It was nearly midnight when a figure appeared at the side entrance to the shop, moving with the careful stealth of someone who did not wish to be seen. Sergeant Lake watched with growing interest as Mabel Finch let herself into her own premises, carrying what appeared to be a large canvas sack. The constable waited several minutes before approaching, giving Mrs. Finch time to become thoroughly engaged in whatever activity had brought her out so late. When he finally knocked on the door, the sound echoed through the quiet shop with startling loudness. "Mrs. Finch, Sergeant Lake here. Might I have a word?" The silence that followed was so prolonged that Lake began to wonder if he'd imagined the figure he'd seen entering. Finally, footsteps approached the door, and Mabel's voice called out with forced cheerfulness. "Oh, Sergeant Lake, what a surprise! I was just doing a bit of late tidying. You know how it is with shop work. There's always something that needs attention." When she opened the door, Lake could see that her usually neat appearance was somewhat disheveled. Her hair had escaped from its customary pins, and there were smudges on her cardigan that looked suspiciously like dust and debris. "Bit late for tidying, isn't it, Mrs. Finch? Mind if I come in and see what you're working on?" The shop's interior was dimly lit by a single lamp near the back counter, creating pools of light and shadow among the familiar displays of yarn and notions. What immediately caught Lake's attention was the canvas sack that lay open near the rear of the shop, filled with what appeared to be various bits of rubbish and paper. "Just clearing out some old stock," Mabel said quickly, moving to position herself between the sergeant and the sack. "You know how these things accumulate. Better to dispose of them properly than let them clutter up the storage areas." Lake approached the sack with professional interest, noting the variety of items it contained. Brown tissue paper, the sort used for wrapping purchases. A roll of the special pencil he had seen used for price marking. A handful of small paper tickets, blank and ready for numbering. "Interesting collection of rubbish," he observed mildly. "Mind if I have a closer look?" In the bottom of the sack, partially hidden beneath the tissue paper, was a small shop waste tin. Lake lifted it carefully, noting that it contained several items that seemed far more significant than ordinary refuse. A torn fragment of bottle label showing only partial lettering that read "Nut Oi" in commercial print. A small white till receipt, crumpled but still legible, bearing the notation "Ground Nut Oil Grosses," with a date from 3 days prior. "Now, this is interesting," Lake said, holding up the receipt. "Ground nut oil from the grocers. Any particular reason you'd be buying cooking oil, Mrs. Finch? I thought your shop specialized in wool and haberdashery items." Mabel's face had gone quite pale in the lamplight. "Oh, that. Well, one uses oil for all sorts of things in shop work, lubricating scissors, treating squeaky hinges. Nothing unusual about that." Lake continued his examination of the waste tin's contents, finding additional items that made his pulse quicken with professional excitement. Among the debris was several more ticket fragments and what appeared to be the remnants of a commercial label that had been deliberately torn apart. But it was his discovery in the shop's back room that provided the most damning evidence. On a work near the window stood a shallow tray containing 2 skeins of linen yarn. One remained dry and normal to the touch, but the other showed clear signs of having been treated with some kind of oil, leaving it with a slightly tacky texture and a faint but distinctly nutty aroma. "Mrs. Finch," Lake said quietly, "I think you better come with me to the station. Inspector Slack will want to have a word with you about these items." Mabel's composed facade finally cracked completely. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for anyone to get seriously hurt. It was just supposed to be a warning, just enough to make her think twice about her plans." Lake made careful note of this admission while gathering the evidence that would prove crucial to solving Beatrix Morton's murder. The midnight visit to dispose of incriminating materials had provided exactly the breakthrough that Miss Marple's intuition had suggested might occur. As he escorted Mabel from the shop, Lake couldn't help but admire the elderly lady's insight. Miss Marple had understood something fundamental about human nature, that guilt and fear would eventually drive the perpetrator to try to eliminate evidence, and that such attempts often provided the very proof that investigators needed. The quiet village street seemed to hold its breath as they walked toward the police station, where Inspector Slack waited to hear the details of what promised to be a very illuminating interview. Behind them, Finch's wool and haberdashery stood empty and dark, its cheerful window display now seeming somehow forlorn in the pale moonlight. The cozy world of village commerce had been revealed to harbor much darker secrets than anyone might have imagined. By morning, Miss Marple reflected, as she finally prepared for bed. The last pieces of the puzzle would likely be in place. The midnight expedition had provided the final evidence needed to demonstrate how a simple knitting evening had been transformed into an occasion for murder. But even as justice moved closer to being served, she couldn't help feeling sadness for the way fear and desperation had driven someone to such desperate measures. The human heart, she knew from long experience, was capable of both great kindness and terrible darkness, often existing side by side in the same person. Tomorrow would bring the final revelations, but tonight she would say a quiet prayer for all concerned, victim and perpetrator alike. Chapter 8. Burnt Label. The morning following Mabel Finch's midnight escapade brought Inspector Slack to the Institute Hall with renewed purpose. Armed with the evidence discovered in the wool shop, he was now able to view the scene of the crime with a much clearer understanding of what had actually transpired that fatal evening. Miss Marple arrived shortly after breakfast, carrying her knitting bag and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose theories were beginning to be vindicated by concrete evidence. "I trust Sergeant Lakes's vigil proved fruitful," she said without preamble. "Indeed, it did. Mrs. Finch's attempt to dispose of evidence has provided us with several crucial pieces of the puzzle, including a receipt for groundnut oil purchased 3 days before the knitting club meeting." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected as much, but I believe there may be additional evidence here in the hall itself that we haven't yet discovered, particularly regarding the preparation of that false label." She moved toward the small kitchen area at the back of the Institute Hall, where a modest gas range served for preparing refreshments during various village functions. The range was old but well-maintained, with a small oven and several burner rings that showed signs of regular use. If someone needed to dispose of incriminating labels quickly and thoroughly, she said, opening the oven door and peering inside, what better place than a convenient fire? Inspector Slack joined her examination of the range, noting immediately that the interior showed signs of recent use. Among the normal accumulation of cooking residue were several small blackened fragments that looked distinctly different from ordinary food debris. "Burned paper," he said, carefully extracting one of the larger pieces with tweezers. "And look here, there's still part of a letter visible." Under close examination, the fragment showed the ghostly remains of what appeared to be commercial printing. The letters Lano were just barely discernible against the charred background. "Lanolin," Miss Marple said with satisfaction. "Someone burned the original lanolin label after removing it from the bottle, probably to ensure that no trace remained of what the bottle had originally contained." They continue their search of the range's interior, finding additional fragments that told a clear story of hasty disposal. Several small pieces of adhesive sticker material, the sort used for product labels, had been reduced to brittle curls by the heat. "The question is, when this burning took place," Slack mused. It would have required access to the Institute kitchen, and preferably a time when such activity wouldn't be noticed. Miss Marple considered this carefully. The knitting club has access to the kitchen for tea preparation, and there was certainly enough confusion during the evening's events that someone could have slipped away briefly without being missed. Returning to the main hall, they turned their attention once again to the bottle of supposed needle conditioner. In the clear morning light, the evidence of tampering seemed even more obvious than before. "Look at the edges of this label," Miss Marple pointed out. "They're remarkably sharp and clean, as if the label had been applied very recently." Compare that to the other items in Mrs. Finch's shop samples. Their labels show the slight softening and wear that comes from normal handling over time. She turned the bottle over carefully, noting a small dot of pencil marking on the underside of the label. And here we have Mrs. Finch's characteristic price pencil mark. She has a habit of making tiny notations on her shop samples to keep track of what's been distributed. Slack was building a comprehensive picture of the evidence. So, we have Mrs. Finch purchasing groundnut oil 3 days before the meeting. The burned remains of what appears to be a lanolin label and a fresh label applied to disguise the bottle's true contents. Precisely. And when we examined Mrs. Morton's bamboo needles again, Miss Marple moved to where Beatrice's knitting materials lay carefully preserved as evidence. Using a clean cloth, she gently wiped the tips of the circular needles, then held the cloth to her nose. The scent is unmistakably nutty. Not the woolly smell of genuine lanolin, but the distinctive aroma of roasted peanuts, the same scent that clings to the linen yarn from package number 7. She examined the yarn more closely, noting how certain sections showed the telltale signs of contamination. "See here, Inspector. These particular strands have that same oily residue and nutty scent. This is the yarn that Mrs. Morton would have handled repeatedly while knitting, and which she would have moistened with her lips when joining new lengths." Slack made detailed notes while Miss Marple continued her analysis of the physical evidence. The case was becoming clearer with each new discovery, but she knew that proving deliberate intent would require more than just demonstrating method and opportunity. "We also need to consider the duplicate ticket that ensured Mrs. Morton received the contaminated yarn," she said, moving to examine the numbered slips once more. The left-handed writing style is quite distinctive. She held up the 2 number 7 tickets, comparing the handwriting carefully. Mrs. Finch is left-handed, as I've observed from watching her write in her shop ledger. Mrs. Trent and Miss Daring are both right-handed, and Mrs. Pike's arthritis makes her handwriting quite different from either of these samples. The evidence was mounting systematically, each piece fitting into a coherent pattern that pointed toward careful premeditation rather than accidental contamination. "But we mustn't forget the red herrings," Miss Marple cautioned. "Miss Trent's obvious resentment over her disqualified pattern, Miss Daring's innocent oil treatment experiment, Mrs. Pike's quiet demeanor that could conceal grievances. Any of these could easily mislead an investigation." She paused by the window, looking out at the peaceful village street, where ordinary life continued its normal rhythm. The truly clever thing about this murder was how it used genuine circumstances to create false suspicion. Miss Daring really did treat her linen with oil, though it was harmless olive oil. Mrs. Trent really does harbor resentment toward Mrs. Morton. These facts could easily be twisted to suggest guilt, when none exists. Slack closed his notebook with a sense of satisfaction, but the physical evidence tells a different story entirely. The groundnut oil receipt, the burned label fragments, the distinctive handwriting on the duplicate ticket. They all point in the same direction. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, they do. What we have here is a very carefully planned murder, disguised as an accidental allergic reaction and designed to cast suspicion on innocent parties. As they prepared to leave the Institute Hall, she reflected on how the cozy world of village crafts had been corrupted by fear and greed. Someone had used the familiar rituals of charitable knitting to commit murder, believing that the innocent setting would provide perfect camouflage for their deadly intentions. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, when all the evidence would be laid out, and the truth finally revealed. But tonight, Miss Marple would say another quiet prayer for justice to be served, and for the peace of mind that comes when truth finally emerges from deception. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the tall windows as they locked the Institute Hall behind them, leaving the scene of the crime to await its final chapter. Chapter 9. Wrong Number. The evening before the final confrontation found Miss Marple in her sitting room, her knitting needles moving with their usual steady rhythm as she worked on a soft blue jumper for the church charity box. But her mind was not on the simple pattern before her. Instead, she was carefully reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to Beatrix Morton's death. Inspector Slack had telephoned earlier to confirm that Maple Finch was being held at the station, though she had said little beyond her initial admission that the plan had gone wrong. Tomorrow would bring the formal gathering where all the evidence would be presented and the full truth revealed. Miss Marple set down her needles and moved to her writing desk, where she began to make careful notes about the two crucial swaps that had made the murder possible. The more she considered the planning involved, the more impressed she became with the careful thought that had gone into the scheme, even as she deplored its deadly purpose. The first swap had been the substitution of a harmless lanolin with deadly groundnut oil in the needle conditioner bottle. This had required advanced preparation, including the purchase of the peanut oil 3 days before the meeting, and the careful removal and replacement of the original label. The burned fragments in the Institute kitchen range testified to the thoroughness with which this deception had been carried out. But it was the second swap that demonstrated the true cleverness of the plan and its dependence on intimate knowledge of the knitting club's routines and Beatrix Morton's personal habits. Miss Marple had realized that Mabel Finch had observed Lucy Daring's innocent experiment with oil treatment of linen yarn during the afternoon before the meeting. Lucy had mentioned this herself, explaining how she had read about softening plant fibers with oil and had tried the technique using olive oil from her mother's kitchen. What Mabel had understood, and what made her plan so diabolically clever, was that this pre-treated yarn would provide the perfect delivery system for the allergen. Beatrix Morton had a well-known habit of moistening yarn ends with her lips when joining new lengths, a common practice among knits that would ensure direct contact between the contaminated yarn and her mouth. The ticket swap had been executed with remarkable audacity during the confusion of the mystery skein drawing. Mabel had prepared a duplicate number 7 ticket written with her left hand to match her natural writing style, and had somehow managed to substitute it for Beatrix's original draw during the bustle and excitement of the evening. Miss Marple paused in her note-taking to consider the psychological aspect of the crime. It had required not only careful planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, but also the ability to act naturally while carrying out each step of the murderous scheme. During the evening itself, Mabel had moved freely around the room, offering her helpful supplies and assistance in the way that everyone had come to expect from the generous shop owner. The needle conditioner had been presented as a thoughtful gift, something to prevent squeaky bamboo needles, a problem that any experienced knitter would appreciate having solved. The contamination of Beatrice's needles had been accomplished under the guise of helpful demonstration. Just a dab to stop the squeak, as Mabel had probably said, while carefully applying the deadly peanut oil to the bamboo tips. And then the helpful assistance with tea service had provided additional opportunities to ensure the contamination was thorough. Within minutes of beginning to work with the treated needles and contaminated yarn, Beatrice had begun to show the first signs of allergic reaction. The progression had been swift, and despite Dr. Haydock's immediate attention, ultimately fatal. Miss Marple reflected on how all suspicion had initially fallen on the tea table and Haley's carefully prepared refreshments. This misdirection had been part of the plan's cleverness. Everyone knew about Beatrice's severe nut allergy and the precautions necessary when preparing food for her. The idea that contamination might come from knitting supplies rather than edible items had seemed almost unthinkable. The red herrings had provided additional camouflage for the real crime. Hazel Trent's obvious resentment over her disqualified pattern had made her an obvious suspect for anyone looking for personal motives. Lucy Daring's oil treatment experiment could easily be misconstrued as evidence of guilty knowledge. Even Edith Pike's habitual quietness might be interpreted as concealing grudges or secrets. But the physical evidence told a much clearer story. The groundnut oil receipt found in Mabel's midnight disposal attempt, the burned label fragments in the Institute kitchen, the fresh appearance of the false needle conditioner label, and the distinctive left-handed writing on the duplicate ticket. All pointed toward careful premeditation rather than accidental contamination or crime of passion. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her thoughts remained focused on the human tragedy that had unfolded in the familiar setting of the village institute. Someone had used the cozy, trusting atmosphere of the knitting club to commit murder, corrupting the simple pleasure of charitable craft work with deadly intention. The telephone rang, interrupting her contemplation. Inspector Slack's voice carried a note of weary satisfaction as he reported on the evening's developments. Mrs. Finch has finally agreed to make a full statement tomorrow morning. She's still insisting it was never meant to be fatal, just a warning to make Mrs. Morton reconsider her plans. But the evidence speaks for itself. Indeed it does, Miss Marple replied quietly, though I suspect there was more to her motivation than simple desire to warn. Fear can drive people to desperate measures, particularly when their livelihood is threatened. After ending the call, she returned her needles, working steadily on the soft blue wool as she considered the tragic waste of the past few days. A life lost, another life ruined, and a community shaken by the revelation that murder could lurk beneath the surface of their peaceful village routines. Tomorrow would bring the final chapter of this sad story, when all the evidence would be laid out, and justice would finally be served. But tonight she would complete another row of stitches and say a quiet prayer for all concerned, victim and perpetrator alike. The autumn evening settled peacefully over St. Mary Me, but the tranquil surface could no longer hide the dark currents that ran beneath the village's civilized facade. Miss Marple had seen such darkness before, and she knew that the human capacity for both kindness and cruelty would continue to surprise and sadden her for as long as she lived. But tomorrow, at least, the truth would finally be told. Chapter 10. Bindoff Reveal. The morning of the final revelation dawned gray and subdued, as if the weather itself reflected the somber nature of the gathering that was about to take place in the Institute Hall. Miss Marple arrived early, carrying her knitting bag and wearing the grave expression appropriate to such a solemn occasion. Inspector Slack had arranged the room carefully, with chairs positioned in a semicircle facing the table, where all the evidence had been laid out in methodical order. The brown bottle with its false label, the burned fragments from the kitchen range, the duplicate tickets, and Beatrix Morton's contaminated knitting materials told their silent story of careful planning and deadly execution. One by one, the surviving members of the knitting club filed into the hall, their faces showing the strain of the past few days. Lady Bantry arrived with her usual flair but subdued manner, followed by the Reverend and Mrs. Clement, whose gentle presence provided a note of comfort in the difficult circumstances. Hazel Trent entered quietly, her dark hair pulled back severely, and her face pale with worry. Lucy Daring looked very young and frightened, clearly overwhelmed by the serious nature of the proceedings. Edith Pike took her customary quiet seat near the back, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Dr. Haddock was also present, having been asked to provide medical testimony about the nature of Beatrix Morton's death. His professional demeanor could not quite conceal his sadness at losing a patient under such tragic circumstances. The last to arrive was Mabel Finch, escorted by Sergeant Lake, and looking far older than her years. The cheerful, bustling shop owner, who'd been such a familiar figure in village life, seemed to have vanished, replaced by a woman whose face bore the unmistakable marks of guilt and despair. Inspector Slack rose to address the assembled group, his voice carrying the formal gravity appropriate to such an occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here this morning to review the evidence surrounding the death of Mrs. Beatrix Morton. What appeared initially to be a tragic accident has proven, upon investigation, to be a case of deliberate murder. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room, though most had suspected as much by now. Hearing it stated so boldly was still shocking. Miss Marple, Slack continued, has been instrumental in uncovering the truth of what happened that evening. I believe she can best explain how this terrible crime was accomplished. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting bag clutched in her hands like a talisman. She looked around the room with a gentle sadness that always marked her revelations of human wickedness. The method employed in poor Mrs. Morton's murder was both clever and cruel, she began quietly. It exploited her severe allergy to nuts, her personal habits as a knitter, and the trusting atmosphere of our charitable gathering. She moved to the evidence table indicating the bottle of false needle conditioner. The murder weapon, if we may call it that, was this bottle of groundnut oil disguised as harmless lanolin. Mrs. Finch purchased the peanut oil 3 days before our meeting and carefully relabeled it to appear as needle conditioner. Mabel Finch's head dropped lower, but she made no sound of protest. The delivery method was Mrs. Morton's own knitting needles, treated with this deadly oil under the guise of helpful maintenance. Mrs. Morton had the habit common among knits of moistening her yarn with her lips when joining new lengths. Contact with the contaminated needles and yarn was sufficient to trigger her fatal allergic reaction. Miss Marple picked up the duplicate ticket bearing the number 7. But the true cleverness of the plan lay in ensuring that Mrs. Morton received yarn that had been pre-treated with oil. Miss Daring had innocently experimented with softening linen using olive oil, creating the perfect delivery system. A duplicate ticket written in Mrs. Finch's characteristic left-handed script was substituted to ensure Mrs. Morton received this particular package. Lucy Daring gasped in horror. "You mean my experiment made it possible? Your innocent action was exploited, my dear, but you bear no responsibility for what followed. The fault lies entirely with someone who twisted harmless actions into deadly purpose." Miss Marple's voice grew gentler as she continued. "The motive for this terrible crime was financial desperation combined with fear of exposure. Mrs. Morton had discovered irregularities in the Knitting Club's yarn fund, inflated invoices, inferior materials passed off as expensive ones, and systematic skimming of the club's money." She looked directly at Mabel Finch, whose shoulders shook with silent sobs. Mrs. Morton had informed Mrs. Finch that afternoon that she would present a full audit at the next meeting, and that the club would be moving its account away from the shop. With winter approaching and business already difficult, this would have meant financial ruin. Inspector Slack stepped forward. "We found evidence of the financial irregularities when we examined the shop's records. Mrs. Morton's suspicions were entirely justified." Miss Marple moved to where Beatrice's unfinished baby vest lay among the evidence. "What makes this crime particularly tragic is how it corrupted something beautiful. Mrs. Morton was working on baby clothes for charity when she died. Her last conscious act was one of generosity and kindness. The room had fallen completely silent, except for the sound of Mabel Finch's quiet weeping. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said gently, "would you like to tell us in your own words what happened?" Mabel raised her head, her face streaked with tears. "It was only meant to frighten her," she whispered. "Just enough to make her ill, to show her what could happen if she went ahead with her plans. I never meant for it to be fatal. I thought just a little contact would make her feel unwell. Nothing more." Dr. Haddock shook his head sadly. Mrs. Morton's allergy was extremely severe. Any contact with peanut oil would have been potentially fatal. "I know that now," Abel sobbed, "but I was desperate. The shop is all I have, all I've ever had. Without it, I'm nothing. I thought if she became ill, she might think twice about pursuing the audit." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. "A little peanut oil is quite a lot to someone with Mrs. Morton's sensitivity. The result was always likely to be fatal." Inspector Slack moved forward with his handcuffs. "Mabel Finch, I arrest you for the murder of Beatrice Morton and for fraud relating to the Knitting Club's funds." As Mabel was led away, the remaining members of the group sat in stunned silence. The cozy world of their knitting club had been forever changed by the revelation of such careful planning and deadly intent. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave, but paused at the door to address the surviving members. "The club's funds will be returned, and I'm sure you'll want to continue Mrs. Morton's charitable work. She would have wanted the baby clothes finished, Lady Bantry murmured. To think someone could kill at a knitting meeting. Miss Marple smoothed her gloves thoughtfully. Clubs, my dear Dolly, are made of habits. Change one habit, and you can tie a very deadly knot indeed. As she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple reflected on how easily trust could be betrayed, and how the familiar routines of civilized life could be corrupted by fear and greed. But she also thought of Beatrice Morton's unfinished baby vest, and how the simple act of knitting for charity would continue despite this terrible interruption. Justice had been served, but the real healing would come from the gradual restoration of trust and the quiet continuation of good works in Beatrice Morton's memory.